Welcome to BYJU'S IAS and a very warm welcome to our weekly survey of international events and issues. We are very happy to discuss with you this week 2 or 3 very interesting topics. One, of course, is the climate change, which has been the focus of international relations for quite some time. This is in the context of the COP26, which is going to meet very soon in Glasgow, and the world has been looking at this opportunity as can this bring back the climate change negotiations to the rails again. They had been derailed after Trump withdrew from the Paris arrangement which his predecessor had agreed upon, and this literally sealed the fate of the Paris Conference of Parties. 5 years and a little more have passed since then. No progress actually has been made. Scientists are unanimously of one view that the time bomb is ticking. The evidence is incontrovertible. You can't dispute the science, as ex-President Trump used to do so. And if the world doesn't react to the climate crisis with alacrity, there might be a point of no return for the world, not only for any particular country, not only for the macro states in the Indian Ocean, but for all of us. But such is the nature of mankind that we think in terms of 5 years, decades, not in terms of quarter centuries, half a century. This is what the problem with the climate change negotiations is. The climate threat is the change of climate, the global warming to most people appears to be something which will not happen in our lifetime. And we are more worried about more strategic flashpoints, military conflicts, civil wars, humanitarian crisis, crimes against war. That is one part. The second part is that, interestingly, when we talk in terms of a conference of parties about climate, we talk in terms of a summit. Now, the summit was a special diplomatic mechanism at the height of the Cold War, where the two adversaries met at the highest level and negotiated the differences between them to ward off a nuclear holocaust or a direct confrontation or a missile crisis. Now, since then, much has changed in the world in summits. Everything is called a summit and everything is supposed to be saving the planet Earth for all of us, from humanitarian crisis to climate change to biodiversity to whatever it is. But these are effectively not actually summits between 2 top leaders or 3 or 4 top leaders. These are more or less multilateral negotiating opportunities where agreement at a minimum shared common program can be met. And this is what made COP especially interesting. But we shall discuss this and some other summits and some other problems in this episode with you. Before we begin that, you keep in mind 2 strong focuses: multilateral diplomacy and climate change negotiations. The irony is that while everybody seems to be highlighting the risk of climate change, what it means for the fate of humanity, at the same time, everybody seems to be totally oblivious of the urgency. This time, the host is Britain in Glasgow, and Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, nobody has forgotten that before he entered politics was a skeptic of the climate change science, climate change issues. He again, like President Trump, shared the view that this was a non-issue. Now, ever since becoming the Prime Minister, he has at least been paying lip service to the problem of the climate change, and he seems to glorify himself with each diplomatic opportunity that comes his way. Especially since Brexit, Boris Johnson has tried to prove the point that if he successfully pulls off some kind of an agreement, even a halfway agreement, which everybody had lost hope of after Trump's withdrawal at Paris, he would have proved that Britain has a role to play on the international arena. But his own credibility is so low that people do not think that he can change colors like a chameleon and work out this arrangement, or people are waiting for him or listening to whatever message he has. The problem is complicated on 2 grounds. Within his cabinet, Boris Johnson's cabinet in Great Britain, the differences between Rishi Sunak, his Chancellor of Exchequer, and himself are very acute. Rishi Sunak is a far more pro-capitalistic, pro-economic development person. He thinks as long as economic development takes place, you don't have to worry too much about greening your economy immediately or having subsidies for the fossil fuel, non-fossil fuel sectors. So people slowly cut down their carbon emissions. Now, before we proceed any further, I think it is time to refresh our memories about what was the arrangement which was being worked out at the Paris Conference of Parties. People were trying to attain before 2050 a rate of carbon emission which was not more than 1.5% of the pre-industrial era. Now, at the moment, the rate, thanks to the COVID interruptions, thanks to Trump's withdrawal from the Paris conference, which almost crippled it, mankind seemed to be progressing towards not 1.5, not even 2, but 3 degrees above Celsius compared to the pre-industrial age by the time the century ends. But for some people, the end of the century is almost 8 decades away, and they are not worried about that. But what they don't realize is that the impact of the climate change much before the temperature of planet reaches 3 degrees or 2 degrees or above even 1.5 degrees, cataclysmic events are going to take place. There are forest fires in California, there are forest fires of unprecedented havoc hazards in Australia, there are cyclones with intensive destructive capacity, there are droughts, there is destruction of biodiversity, there is glacial melt, there are flash floods, there are unusually destructive floods, and nobody big or small is untouched by that. You look at China, where there have been floods where hundreds of people have died, the flood waters has inundated coal mines, and it has posed a great threat to very large dams which China has built on major rivers. Nothing catastrophic has happened so far, but the signs are for all there to see, including for China. China also is having one of the most polluted atmosphere in capital city Beijing itself. It is aware that it is one of the largest producers thanks to its large population, so it has to cut down its fossil fuels. But at the same time, the Chinese are also aware that they are facing an energy crisis. So far, they have registered a positive economic growth, one of the exceptional countries after COVID which has registered a positive economic development growth. But the point is that they know that they cannot continue this pace unless they use the fossil fuels which are available to them. It is one of the largest importers of fossil fuel energy, either petrol or gas from Russia or from coal from Australia at one stage. Now, if you look at this picture, the Chinese have set for themselves zero emission targets by 2050. They also have told the world that if not 2050, by 2060, they would have a zero footprint, negative footprint of carbon. But this is difficult to believe that they can maintain this if they cut down all their fossil fuel consumption, and it has an impact on their economy. The impact on Chinese economy is not the only thing which is worrying the world, because it affects the supply chains, and the countries like United States are already complaining about disruptions in supply chains, outsourcing of their products or their parts, and they are facing the impact. Partly it is the result of the sanctions which the Western world has imposed on China, but much of it is due to also the climate change. But we'll come to that a little later. But then let's come back to the United States of America. We have been talking about Boris Johnson and the divisions within his cabinet about what is the right approach towards climate change, and Britain also has to worry very much about energy, because Britain, if it says that we don't depend on fossil fuels, we don't use the coal at our disposal, shale oil at our disposal, then how does it absorb the impact of the Brexit and the economic disruptions? Already there are worries, apprehensions in Great Britain about a bleak Christmas, a freezing winter, etc. But when we turn to United States of America, we see that their problems are as acute. Biden, who supposed to be a pro-climate change scientific person, facing the humanitarian crisis, facing the global crisis squarely, but his performance has not matched his pre-election rhetoric. He has greatly disappointed the Greens. But the problem is quite acute. The Democrats do not enjoy a clear majority in the Senate. They are razor thin majority, 50-50 split, with the Speaker's casting vote important, the Vice President's casting vote to be very important. But the interesting part is that there are some centrist Democrats who have received very large donations from the fossil fuel industry and who have dug their heels in, and they say that No, it's like almost like the Luddite Trump, that I don't think that, like Senator Machinin says, that I don't think that this is good economics, good science to subsidize non-fossil fuel energy resources. So he represents a state which is tied to the fossil fuel industry, and there might be other dithering centrist, moderate, slightly conservative Democrats who might not vote according to Biden's dictates. Now, Biden had proposed a $3 trillion economic recovery plus coping with the energy crisis proposal, but it almost fell through, and he has had to cut it down to from $3 trillion to maybe 2.5 or even less, and this would have an effect down the line in all the economy. So Biden has to do a very delicate balancing act within his own party to carry all the Democrats through. So some Democrats and some Republicans. Now this is a strange fact of American political life, that the senators there vote according to what they think is their conscience, but which also is according to the wishes of their supporters and major donors in elections. Some of them nurse presidential ambitions, and there is a very tricky situation that America is a large producer and exporter of fossil fuels, so it cannot preach one kind of a prescription to the rest of the world when it doesn't really act accordingly itself. So people are worried that Biden might give the Glasgow Summit a miss, Xi Jinping may give Glasgow Summit a miss, and there is a speculation that Mr. Modi might also follow suit and give the Glasgow Summit a miss. If all these three major leaders, including two of the large carbon footprint countries like China and India, and one of the largest vested interests in fossil fuels, United States of America, and its proteges, the Saudi Arabs, are not on the same line, how do we know that this summit is going to be a success? There is a big question mark on this summit's success. This is not all. There have been very strong criticisms of Boris Johnson's inaptitude, his lack of experience about running these conferences, multilateral conferences. They need a preparation time, and he has been distracted. He has been distracted either taking a holiday or talking about the COVID mismanagement or the rise of terror, lone wolf attacks in England, education crisis. Everything has been mismanaged, from NHS to lorry drivers to post-Brexit mismanagement of the arrangements, running battle about fisheries, about the French counterparts. So he has had very little time to give to the preparation for the Glasgow Summit. Now, no conference of party can succeed if enough preparation has not taken place. The United States at least appointed John Kerry as a special envoy for environmental purposes. What it does, how much he can do, is besides the question. It is like Al Gore, at one time the Vice President of the United States, who made the greening issue a very important issue, but then he lost his presidential election bid. You see, so the problem is that we have to keep in mind that making a rhetorical stance, following it up in policy at home, is a very, very difficult proposition altogether. Now, the criticism of Boris Johnson is that he has given to one Alok Verma, a junior minister in his cabinet, the task of looking after this Glasgow Summit, and it has been all the major sponsors. I will come to the question of sponsors in a bit, like Microsoft, like Hitachi, like Big Sky, like NatWest. All of them have complained that they were assured by the British government that they would be given exclusive rights in the green zone to advertise their projects, to make a bid for making their brands popular, and they would defray the cost of organizing the conference to the tune of £250,000 or euros, whatever figure you want to put on it. Now, this is interesting. Now, these companies, the big players, are saying that they were supporting the non-fossil fuel renewable energy greening options or commitments to reduce the carbon footprint by a timeline, however unrealistic it may seem, but some progress was better than none at all, because they were assured that they would have exclusive branding and opportunity of meeting the top leaders. If the top leaders are not appearing physically, so the opportunity is not even like the Doha Summit where they can rub shoulders with them. As long as they claim that in the blue zone, the United Nations is also giving space to their rivals to put up their brands and trademarks and logos and give them the similar kind of opportunity. So which means that the British government has reneged or gone back on its commitment to giving these big companies. There is a company like Unilever. The Unilever of course has not signed the same complaint letter which the others, Hitachi, Microsoft, NetWest, Sky and others have signed. But this is again interesting because you have a situation where the climate change conference of parties has become a jamboree of big business to cash in on this opportunity, like the Olympic Games, for marketing themselves, for branding themselves, finding an opportunity to lobby for their specialized interests with political leaders. So the climate change issues go into the back burner. There are other problems that are plaguing the Glasgow Summit. There are concerns that it might pose a very serious security threat, especially in the context of the violent attacks on the British lawmakers. It may not be, Great Britain is not as divided a nation as United States of America, maybe at the moment, between the rich and the poor, the white skinned and the dark, but there are resentments in Scotland, in Wales, in Northern Ireland post-Brexit, and there are protesters who might use this opportunity to mount an all-out attack, almost anarchist attack on the British government, which the British government is very reluctant to accept the challenge. Also at the same time, the protests are not confined to Britain. Already protesters, the green protesters who are unhappy with Biden's equivocating between economic rationalism and the future of mankind, have also mounted large protests outside the White House. Now, it is impossible to suppress all these protests, the voices of protest, voices of dissent, and people think that from a teenager, she is no longer a teenager now, Greta Thunberg, to other people, more saner people, older sages, who talk about the shared future of humanity, which hinges on this very, Biden himself has used a very graphic way that the fate of mankind hangs by a very slender thread. But it is one thing to say a very nice turn of phrase. Other is whether you can use this slender thread to save your life or allow it to break or tie a knot which cannot be untied soon. And one doesn't know how the Russian President Vladimir Putin is going to behave. He has got his oil diplomacy, his gas diplomacy very beautifully integrated. He can turn the screws on the Ukrainians through whose territory the Russian gas passes. He is about to inaugurate the Nord 2 stream which will bypass Ukraine, and there is a very complex system of this gas being transferred from Russia to Ukraine, and Ukraine takes it at the eastern frontier, replaces it with the gas produced by Ukraine itself on the western front, pushes it on towards Europe. But if Russia bypasses Ukraine totally and continues with salami slicing on the eastern border, they don't have an option. They are vulnerable to this fossil fuel blackmail. So equally vulnerable is Western Europe. France and Germany are dependent on this. So I think the problem is that if you keep in mind so many imponderables, that leader A, B, C will not attend, protesters might wreck the works, there is no momentum generated, the principal sponsors who are going to defray the expenses of this conference are unhappy almost a fortnight or more before the conference is there. So no substantial progress has been made, and only cliches are being repeated, including the Queen herself has said that the world leaders keep talking but they don't take, I'm sick of their hypocrisy, they don't take action. The moment she said so, the critics were quick to pounce on the royal family and say that the royal family itself is a past master at using only words and not actually doing it. Their own carbon footprints, their own associations with lobbyists and fossil fuel industry are pretty strong. Now basically what it boils down to is a question in the post-COVID world. No leader can neglect generation of employment, economic development, and both of these depend very largely to mining industry, to shipping industry, to generation of electricity through fossil fuels, and all this creates a major problem. Although the renewable, non-traditional energy is getting more efficient, getting cheaper to use, has demonstrated its capacity, but it cannot be switched on almost overnight. Now, neither of the other options, the nuclear energy or large dams, has been successful. Both have been flawed. So you have to get back to a situation, how do you reduce the carbon footprint to an extent where the planet doesn't warm. Forget it. Nobody thinks that 1.5 degrees Celsius before the industrial age is a achievable target. But even if you can confine it for 2 degrees or thereabouts, slightly above 2 degrees in foreseeable future, we might have a consensus on how to proceed on this change. Take an instance from India itself. Very recently the monsoons were over, but post-monsoon rains were so heavy that they flooded major cities like Hyderabad, Bengaluru, Mumbai, and also there were massive landslides, mudslides in Kerala, where more than 25-30 people have lost their lives. Now the point is that you don't even know when something of this kind unexpected might happen, triggered by climate change, which you thought was decades away, and we didn't have to worry about that. So there have been prescient authors of an Indian origin, Amitav Ghosh, who has talked of the great derangement, who has tried to merge fiction and myth and folklore and present science and connected the dots to say that we cannot neglect this crisis any longer. But then this background, this backdrop, again to Glasgow, has not been absorbed by the decision makers at all. They are either worried about border incursions, they are worried about infiltrators from across the border, they are worried about communal disharmony, they are of course worried about, with good reason, international terrorist attacks. So these take our attention away from this major problem, which may be no less destructive at all. Another related issue with this is of biodiversity. If the climate changes, if the glaciers recede, if the droughts increase, you have destruction, unprecedented destruction of biodiversity. And once biodiversity changes, we do not even know whether we can either replenish the lost species, we don't even know, the science doesn't even know what is the interdependence of one life form on another life form. How do the disease vectors multiply, they jump across the species? And the COVID itself was an issue which said that this probably was an issue related to climate change and biodiversity, where the virus from bats or pangolins could move over to human beings. We don't even know, because the inquiry into the origins of COVID has never been satisfactorily concluded. But there is another summit coming up, close on the heels of the Conference of Parties in Glasgow. This is the Conference of Parties about biodiversity in Kunming in China. Now the problem here is even more acute, because the Chinese are not the most popular international actor because of their aggressive expansionist plans in South China Sea, their confrontation in the Sea of Japan, in confrontationist posture with Taiwan, encouraging their protégé North Korea to test missiles, they themselves testing hypersonic missiles, they threatening Americans and others to take off their warboats, going ahead with their programs of nuclear submarines, confronting India on the land border, on the Himalayan borderland, getting active into Afghanistan, getting active into Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, in the Middle East sector. So all this doesn't bode well for the climate change or either for biodiversity. How many people would go and participate if they are giving a miss to the Glasgow Summit on Climate, to the Biodiversity Summit? Again, if you go back to the Biodiversity Summit, the Biodiversity Agreement was signed way back in 1990s, and not much progress has been made after that. And there is a highly technical kind of an arrangement about biogenetically manipulated crops, biogenetically manipulated life forms, and how they impact the biodiversity at large. So there are biodiversity hotspots, and unfortunately these biodiversity hotspots are in remote areas. They might be in Chinese wilderness, they might be in wilderness in Amazon rainforest. And once again, if you see how irresponsible the leadership in these parts has been, take for instance one example of Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, who was a willing party till very great pressure was brought upon him to at least suspend for the time being the planned destruction of the Amazon rainforest. He was not only destroying the way of life of indigenous people, but it was thousands of hectares of rainforest was being destroyed systematically for alternative urbanization or use of timber resources or for mining, and nobody was giving a thought to biodiversity destruction. Now, he again was not only a skeptic about the climate change, he was skeptic about coronavirus. He suffered corona himself, and he's been accused of large scale corruption. There are hundreds and thousands of people asking protesters for his impeachment, but the situation remains tense in Brazil itself. So if you come to think of it, neither biodiversity nor climate change is likely, despite these so-called summit conferences, allow humanity to focus on a resolution. So, before we switch to the problem of summits and other summits elsewhere, I think we must keep in mind that we cannot let this issue slip from our radar, our mental radar. Climate change is as serious as an international terror attack, as serious as a crime against humanity or a crime or a war crime. We cannot treat this as a lesser calamity, because you don't know when it will strike like the bolt from the blue. We are working on a time frame that this might happen in 30 years, 40 years, but it might hit us even earlier. It is time to talk now about uses and abuses of the word summit diplomacy, multilateral efforts to find common solutions of global problems. We had a look at the proposed conference of parties, Glasgow, about climate change, about its ancillary conference of parties in Kunming, not related but still integrally involved in Kunming, and try to see that what are the bottlenecks, what is the difference between hypocrisy of big actors about practicing one thing and prescribing another to someone else, and also the vested interests which make it very difficult in politics, in domestic politics, to take a clear-cut stand and follow it through. Because if you take a stance in favor of fighting the climate change challenge over anything else, there might be loss of support at home, and you might not be returned to power, or you might not have the efficacy or the budgetary allocation to meet the promises which you have made. This is the kind of thing which the world has seen when America failed to ratify the League of the Nations or to join it after Woodrow Wilson had formed it. So repeatedly this has happened, and it has happened when President Trump walked out of Paris Conference of Parties, wrecking it practically for the next 5 years, losing valuable time. In the meantime, both sides have regrouped. The fossil fuel lobby has regrouped, the conservative domestic opponents of the climate change have regrouped, and also the more aggressive protesters have also regrouped. But that is not what we are concerned with at the moment. We are concerned with any time you have a multilateral forum and you have more than 3-4 participants there, it is called a summit. But the summits need adequate preparation. These summits are very different from the summit conferences organized dramatically, not organized, they had to be organized dramatically at the height of the Cold War, because you wanted to avert a nuclear holocaust or confrontation or an arms race. Right now, everything is called a crisis. Everything is supposed to be a global concern, and everything being a global concern and a crisis becomes not a crisis but an acute endemic kind of a disease, and people they become desensitized to the problem. This is what is happening to the summit conferences. So the preparation is not adequate. The diplomatic skills required to have group discussions, group negotiations is being lost. Most of the time people bank too much on posturing, on trying to have photo ops, trying to promote their sponsors, trying to make everything a commercial enterprise. It is some kind of an entertainment, a tamasha, a spectacle, and this has eroded the credibility of the summit conferences. Before we conclude, we want to touch on one other summit conference which is not focused on climate, which is not focused on biodiversity, but does represent a large influential section of actors in international arena. That is the summit of the ASEAN leaders, and it has been remarkable because for the first time the ASEAN leaders who again act consensually, have taken a decision which has not been very popular among some leaders, that they would not invite the military leader of Myanmar to this summit conference, and the military leader has reacted. Aung Min Thilang has reacted very violently by saying this is a Western conspiracy, there is a political interference in the sovereign rights of the Myanmarese nation, and he would retaliate inappropriate measure if he can, when he can, etc. But the point is that the ASEAN has not actually shown spine. They have said that they would allow a non-governmental representative to join this summit. Now, obviously, they are not going to grant a de jure recognition to the opponents, the protesters, the government in exile from Myanmar into this ASEAN summit. So, what purpose does it serve? It is again like a tamasha, like a spectacle in Olympics, which bans the participants by Russian state because they have been caught abusing the doping laws, anti-doping laws, and they would allow the Russian team to participate under the banner of the Russian Olympic Association. So, if there is a representative who is not effective at the moment in politics in Myanmar, how does any participation become meaningful in this country? What is even more interesting, which I think we should focus on, we are taking so much interest in climate, we are taking so much interest in oil, gas. Why are we not talking in terms of the response of the ASEAN countries to this? Indonesia is an oil producing exporting country, Malaysia is an oil producing exporting country, Brunei is an oil producing exporting country, Vietnam and Philippines have limited resources, but they have resources and they have claims to oil resources under the seabed, extending from the exclusive economic zones from disputed islands in the South China Sea. So this is a territory which represents a large concentration of population on this planet. Indonesia is one of the largest nations, geographical stretch of the archipelago is large. It also is a country where the population is Muslim. So there is a very volatile mix, whether it is Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia. They are countries which are populous, they are strategically located, there is Islamic fundamentalism creeping in, and there is also the fossil fuel. There are also tropical rainforests in Borneo. So this whole thing of biodiversity, climate change concerns them very, very personally, immediately. And this, I think, is something which we should worry about. So we talk of a summit very casually. The ASEAN summit will take place. Some people would say, oh, the SCO summit is taking place. Somebody would say a little later, BRICS summit would take place. We will talk about BRICS at some other time in greater details, but in this context of ASEAN summit, I think we again have to think very realistically that why are we avoiding the substantial issues in which the ASEAN states are keeping silent. Oil and gas, biodiversity, climate change, how it affects them and how it affects their neighbors, and is there a greater priority for them, creeping threat of Islamization, Islamic terror, which is keeping their mouth shut, and why, and what is their relationship with China, their largest trading partner? How long can they resist the pressure from China? This is all we have for you this week, but we hope that you have grappled the complexity of not only the issue of climate change, global warming, destruction of biodiversity, but also of the compulsions of major actors, United States, Russia, China, Brazil, India, Indonesia, who have this problem of balancing their domestic political concerns and priorities with something which is a common threat for mankind immediately. They can't get away from it. Sooner or later, we have to face this. And does it raise a more fundamental question, that the hopes that everything could be solved reasonably, rationally, if we had multilateral diplomacy played on a level field honestly and transparently? If this is not so, then what hope is there for mankind and diplomacy? A big question. We'll meet you again next week. Till then, goodbye and thank you.